Chapter 5 Spring. The landscape south of the chasm was rougher than that to the north. It was not hilly, but mountainous. The tallest peaks were enchanted with white snow. The narrow passes were choked with almost impenetrable growth, forcing Bink to detour again and again. Ordinary nettles and itch bushes would have been bad, but there was no telling what magic these strange plants had. A lone tangle tree was well worth avoiding, and there were whole groves of related species. He could not risk it. So whenever an aspect of the jungle balked him, Bink turned back and tried again farther along. He avoided the most obvious paths also. They were suspect. Thus he tramped through intermediate vegetation, the borderline between jungle and field, often in the roughest terrain of all. Barren, burning rock faces, steep rocky slopes, high wind-swept plateaus. What even magic plants disdained was hardly worth any person's trouble, except for the traveler who wanted to stay out of trouble. One cleared area turned out to be the landing strip for a very large flying dragon. No wonder there were no other predators in that region. Bink's progress was so slow that he knew it would take him many days to reach the good magician's castle. He fashioned himself a burrow in the ground, with a pile of stones for a windshield and a dead brush for a blanket, and slept uncomfortably. He wondered now why he hadn't at least accepted the sorceress's offer to stay the night. It would surely have been more comfortable than this. No, he knew why he had to go. He might never have left the island after that night, not as his own man. And if he had, Sabrina would never have forgiven him. The very fact that such a night tempted him in retrospect, and not merely for the comfort of sleep, meant that it was not a night he could have afforded. He reminded himself of that several times before he shivered himself to sleep. Then he dreamed of a diamond crystal palace, woke with mixed emotions, and had to shiver his way to sleep again. Turning down temptation certainly wasn't much pleasure when alone on the open trail. Tomorrow, he would search diligently for a blanket tree and some hot soup gourds. On the third morning of his South Chasm leg, he trekked along a ridge, his only feasible route westward. He had cut himself a new staff, after several tries. The first saplings he went for magicked him off by using aversion spells of assorted types. He had no doubt there were many suitable trees he never saw at all because of their passive "do not notice me" spells. One used a physical repulsion charm directed at cutting objects. Every time he slashed at it, his knife veered away. About an hour on the way with his new staff, he was still pondering the natural selectivity of magic. The plants with the most effective spells survived best, so became more common. But how many times did stray travelers come by here with knives? Then he realized that he might make good use of that repulsion spell. If he succeeded in cutting a staff from such a tree, would it repel all attacks against him? Obviously, this magic was for defense against the depredations of dragons, beavers, and such, not actual knives. And he would certainly feel safer with an anti-dragon staff. No. Cutting the tree would kill it, and its magic would abate. But maybe a seed from it. No sense consuming time going back. He should be able to locate another such tree. All he had to do was attempt to cut a new staff and note which tree repulsed his knife. He might be able to dig up a small one and take it entire, keeping it alive and effective. He moved down the side of the ridge, testing trees. This proved to be more hazardous than anticipated. The knife's approach toward their tender bark brought out the worst in them. One dropped hard fruit on him, barely missing his head. Another exhaled sleep perfume that almost stopped his journey right there. But no cutting aversion spells now. One large tree had a dryad, an inhabiting wood nymph, who looked very fetching, about like Iris at 14, but who cursed Bink roundly in most unladylike language. "If you want to carve defenseless things, go carve your own kind," she screamed. "Go carve the wounded soldier in the ditch, you son of a—" Fortunately, she balked at completing the rhyme. Dryads were not supposed to know such language. Wounded soldier? Bink located the ditch and explored it carefully. Sure enough, there lay a man in military apparel, blood crusted on his back, groaning piteously. "Peace," Bink said. "I will help you if you permit." Xanth had once needed a real army, but now the soldiers were mostly messengers for the king. Still, their costumes and pride remained. "Help me," the man exclaimed weakly. "I will reward you. Somehow." Now Bink felt it safe to approach. The soldier was severely wounded and had lost much blood. He was burning with the fever of infection. "I can't do anything for you myself. I'm no doctor, and if I even move you, you may expire. I will return with medication," Bink said. "I must borrow your sword." If the soldier gave up his sword, he was really sick. "Return soon, or not at all," the man gasped, raising the hilt. Bink took the heavy weapon and climbed out of the ditch. He approached the tree of the dryad. "I need magic," he told her. "Blood restoration, wound healing, fever abatement, that sort of thing. Tell me where I can get them, quickly, or I will chop your tree down." "You wouldn't," she cried, horrified. Bink hefted the sword menacingly. At this moment, he reminded himself of Jama, the village sword conjurer. The image disgusted him. I'll tell, she screamed. "Okay, tell." He was relieved. He doubted that he could actually have made himself chop down her tree. That would have killed her, and to no real purpose. Dryads were harmless creatures, pretty to look at. There was no point in molesting them or their cherished tree homes. 3 miles to the west, the spring of life. Its water will cure anything. Bink hesitated. "There is something you're not telling me," he said, hefting the sword again. "What's the catch?" "I may not reveal it," she cried. "Anyone who tells, the curse." Bink made as if to chop at the trunk of the tree. The dryad screamed with such utter misery that he abated the effort. He had fought to protect Justin Tree back at home. He could not ravage this one. "All right, I'll risk the curse," he said. He set off westward. He found a path leading his way. It was not an inviting one, merely an animal run, so he felt justified in using it with caution. It seemed others knew the route to the spring. Yet as he approached, he became increasingly nervous. What was the catch, and what was the curse? He really ought to know before he either risked himself or gave the water to the ailing soldier. Xanth was the land of magic, but magic had its rules and its qualifications. It was dangerous to play with magic unless the precise nature of the spell was understood. If this water really could heal the soldier, it was a most strongly enchanted spring. For that sort of aid, there had to be a price. He found the spring. It was in a depression under a giant spreading acorn tree. The tree's health augured well for the water. It could hardly be poisoned. But there could be some other menace associated with it. Suppose a river monster were hiding in it, using the water as a lure for the unwary. Injured or dying creatures would be easy prey. A false reputation for healing would attract them from many miles around. Bink didn't have time to wait and watch. He had to help the soldier now, or it would be too late. So this was a risk he simply had to take. He moved cautiously to the spring. It looked cool and clear. He dipped his canteen into it, keeping his other hand on the sword. But nothing happened. No grim tentacle rose from the depths to challenge him. Viewing the filled canteen, he had another thought. Even if the water were not poisoned, it was not necessarily curative. What use to take it to the soldier if it wouldn't do the job? There was only one way to find out. He was thirsty anyway. Bink put the canteen to his mouth and sipped. The water was chill and good. He drank more deeply and found it supremely refreshing. It certainly wasn't poisoned. He dipped the canteen again and watched the bubbles rise. They distorted the view of his left hand under the water, making it seem as if he had all his fingers. He did not think much about the digit he had lost in childhood, but such a view of a supposedly complete hand teased him unpleasantly. He lifted out the canteen and almost dropped it. His finger was whole. It really was. The childhood injury had been eliminated. He flexed it and touched it, amazed. He pinched it and it hurt. No question, his finger was real. The spring really was magic. If it could heal a 15-year-old amputation so cleanly and painlessly and instantly, it could heal anything. How about a cold? Bink sniffed and discovered that his nose was clear. It had cured his sniffles, too. No question about it. He could recommend this spring of life. A true description for a potent magic. If this spring were a person, it would be a full magician. Again, Bink's natural caution came into play. He still did not know the nature of the catch, or of the curse. Why could no one tell the secret of this spring? What was the secret? Obviously not the fact of its healing properties. The Dryad had told him that, and he could tell it to others. The curse could not be a river monster, for none had struck. Now that Bink was whole and well, he would be much better able to defend himself. Scratch one theory. But this did not mean there was no danger. It merely meant the threat was much more subtle than he had thought. A subtle danger was the worst of all. The man who fled from the obvious menace of a flaming dragon could succumb to the hidden menace of the peace spell of the pines. The soldier was dying. Moments were precious, yet Bink delayed. He had to ferret this out, lest he put both the soldier and himself in greater peril than before. It was said that a person should not look a gift unicorn in the mouth, lest it prove to be enchanted. But Bink always looked. He kneeled before the spring and stared deep into it, looking it in the mouth, as it were. "O spring of life," he murmured, "I come on a mission of mercy, seeking no profit for myself, though I have indeed benefited. I conjure you to reveal your rationale, lest I inadvertently trespass." He had little confidence in this formal invocation, since he had no magic with which to enforce it, but it was all he could think of. He just couldn't accept such a wonderful gift without trying to ascertain the payment to be exacted. There was always a price. Something swirled deep in the spring. Bing felt the potent magic of it. It was as if he peered through a hole into another world. Oh yes, this spring had its own consciousness and pride. The field of its animus rose up to encompass him, and his consciousness plunged through the depths, bringing comprehension. Who imbibes of me may not act against my interest, on pain of forfeiture of all that I bring him. Uh-oh. This was a self-preservation spell, plain and simple, but enormously complicated in its execution. Who defined what was or was not contrary to the interests of the spring? Who but the spring itself? There would obviously be no lumbering in this region, for cutting trees could damage the environment and change the climate, affecting rainfall. No mining, for that could lower the water table and pollute the spring. Even the prohibition against revealing the rationale made sense, for people with minor injuries and complaints might not use the magic water if they knew the price in advance. The loggers and miners certainly wouldn't. But any action had extending, if diminishing, consequences, like the ripples of a stone dropped in a pool. In time, such ripples could cover the whole ocean, or the whole of Xanth in this case. Suppose the spring decided that its interest was threatened indirectly by some action of the distant king of Xanth, such as levying a tax on lumber that caused the lumbermen to cut more wood in order to pay it. Would the spring force all its users to oppose the king, perhaps assassinating him? A person who owed his life to the spring might very well do it. It was theoretically possible for this magic spring to change the whole society of Xanth, even to become its de facto ruler. But the interests of one isolated spring were not necessarily the interests of the human society. Probably the magic of the spring could not extend to such extremes, or it wouldn't have to be as strong as the massed power of all the other entities of Xanth. But slowly, given time, it would have its effect, which made this an ethical question. I cannot accept your covenant, Bink said into the deep swirl. I hold no animosity toward you, but I cannot pledge to act only in your interest. The interest of the whole of Xanth is paramount. Take back your benefits. I go my own way. Now there was anger in the spring. The unfathomable depths of it roiled. The field of magic rose up again, enveloping him. He would suffer the consequences of his temerity. But it faded like a dissipating storm, leaving him whole. His finger remained healed, and his cold was still cured. He had called the springs bluff, and won. Or had he? Maybe his benefits would not be revoked until he acted specifically against the interest of the spring. Well, his benefits were minor. He could afford the penalty. He certainly would not be deterred from doing what he felt was right by fear of that consequence. Bink stood, keeping the sword in his hand as he slung the strap of the canteen over his shoulder. He turned. A chimera was crawling toward him. Bink whipped his sword around, though he was hardly expert in its use. Chimeras were dangerous. But in a moment, he saw that the creature was in dire straits. The tongue was hanging out of its lion's head. Its goat's head was unconscious, and the snake's head at the end of the tail was dragging on the ground. The creature was scraping along on its stomach toward the spring, trailing blood. Bink stood aside and let it pass. He held no malice even for a chimera in this state. He had never before seen a living creature suffering like this, except the soldier. The chimera reached the water and plunged its lion head in, drinking desperately. The change was immediate. The goat's head snapped erect and awake, swiveling from its neck in the middle of the back to glare at Bink. The snake head hissed. No doubt about it, the chimera was healthy again. But now it was dangerous, for this class of monster hated all things human. It took a step toward Bink, who held his sword tightly before him in both hands, knowing that flight would be futile. If he wounded it, he might escape before it dragged itself back to the spring for a second restoration. But abruptly, the thing turned away, without attacking. Bink sighed with relief. He had put up a front, but the last thing he wanted to do was to engage in combat with such a monster, in the presence of an unfriendly spring. There must be a general truce in this vicinity, Bink realized. It was contrary to the interest of the spring to have predators lurk here, so no hunting or fighting was permitted. Lucky for him. He scrambled up the slope and headed east. He hoped the soldier had survived. The soldier had. He was tough, as soldiers tended to be. He refused to gasp out his last until nature ripped it from him. Bink dribbled some magic water into his mouth, then poured some over the wound. Suddenly, the man was well. "What did you do?" he cried. "It's as if I never got stabbed in the back." They walked up the hill together. "I fetched water from a magic spring," Bink explained. He paused at the dryad's tree. This accommodating nymph very kindly directed me to it. "Why, thank you, nymph," the soldier said. "Any favor I can do in return." "Just move on," she said tightly, eyeing the sword in Bink's hand. They moved on. "You can't act contrary to the interest of that spring," Bink said, "or tell anyone about the price you paid for its help. If you do, you'll be right back where you started. I figured the price was worth it for you." "I'll say. I was doing patrol duty, guarding a patch of the king's eyeball ferns, when somebody... Hey, one drink of this elixir, and the king's eyes would be perfect without those ferns, wouldn't they? I should take..." He broke off. "I can show you where the spring is," Bink offered. "Anybody can use it, as far as I know." "No, it's not that. I just suddenly got the feeling. I don't think the king ought to have this water." This simple comment had a profound impact on Bink. Did it confirm his reasoning that the spring's influence extended widely and selfishly? Revived health of the king might not be in the interest of the spring, so... But, on the other hand, if the king were cured by spring water, then the king himself would serve the spring's interest. Why would the spring object to that? Also, why had Bink himself not suffered the loss of his finger and the restoration of his cold when he told the secret to the soldier? He had defied the spring, yet paid no penalty. Was the curse a mere bluff? The soldier extended his hand. "I'm Crombie, Corporal Crombie. You saved my life. How can I repay you?" "Oh, I just did what was right," Bink said. "I couldn't just let you die. I'm on my way to the magician Humphrey to see if I have any magic talent." Crombie put his hand to his beard, pondering. He was rather handsome in that pose. "I can tell you the direction." He closed his eyes, put out his right hand, and slowly rotated. When his pointing finger stabilized, he opened his eyes. "Magician's that way. That's my talent. Direction. I can tell you where anything is." "I already know the direction," Bink said. "West. My main problem is getting through all this jungle. There's so much hostile magic." "You said it," Crombie agreed heartily. "Almost as much hostile magic as there is in civilized regions. The raiders must have magicked me here, figuring I'd never get out alive and my body would never be found. My shade couldn't avenge me in the deep jungle." "Oh, I don't know about that," Bink said, thinking of the shade Donald in the chasm. "But now that I've recovered, thanks to you, Tell you what, I'll be your bodyguard until you reach the magician. Is that a fair return? You really don't need to. Oh, but I do. Soldier's honor. You did me a good turn. I'll do you a good turn. I insist. I can help you a lot. I'll show you. He closed his eyes again, extended his hand, and rotated. When he stopped, he continued. That's the direction of the greatest threat to your welfare. Want to verify it? No, Bink said. Well, I do. Danger never went away by being ignored. Got to go out and conquer it. Give me back my sword. Bink gave it back, and Crombie proceeded in the direction he had pointed, north. Bink followed, disgruntled. He did not want to seek out danger, but he knew it was not right to let the soldier walk into it in his stead. Maybe it was something obvious, like the Gap Dragon, but that was no immediate threat, so long as Bink stayed out of the chasm. He fully intended to stay out. When Crombie found himself balked by thick brush, he simply slashed it away with his sword. Bink noticed that some of the vegetation gave way before the blade actually struck. If providing a path was the best route to survival, these plants took it. But suppose the soldier hacked into a tangle tree. That could be the danger he had pointed out. No, a tangler was deadly to the unwary, but it did not move from the place it had rooted. Since Bink had been going west, not north, no stationary thing was much of a threat to him unless it was west. There was a scream. Bink jumped, and Crombie held his sword at the ready. But it was only a woman, cringing and frightened. Speak, girl, Crombie roared, flourishing his wicked blade. What mischief do you intend? Don't hurt me, she cried. I am only Dee, lost and alone. I thought you came to rescue me. You lie, Crombie exclaimed. You mean harm to this man, my friend who saved my life. Confess. And he lifted his sword again. For God's sake, let her be, Bink yelled. You made a mistake. She's obviously harmless. My talent's never been wrong before, Crombie said. This is where it pointed, your greatest threat. Maybe the threat is behind her. Beyond, Bink said. She was merely in the line of sight. Crombie paused. Could be. I never thought of that. He was evidently a reasonable man, under the violence. Wait, I'll verify. The soldier withdrew somewhat, stationing himself to the east of the girl. He shut his eyes and rotated. His pointing finger came to bear squarely on Dee. The girl burst into tears. I mean you no harm. I swear it. Don't hurt me. She was a plain girl, of strictly average face and figure. No beauty. This was in contrast to the several females Bink had encountered recently. Yet there was something vaguely familiar about her, and Bink was always unnerved by feminine distress. Maybe it's not physical danger, he said. Does your talent differentiate? No, it doesn't, Crombie admitted, a bit defensively. It can be any kind of threat, and she may not actually mean you harm. But sure as hell, there's something. Bink studied the girl, whose sniffles were drying up. That familiarity. Where had he seen her before? She was not from the North Village, and he really had not encountered many girls elsewhere. Somewhere on his current journey? Slowly the notion dawned on him. A sorceress of illusion did not have to make herself beautiful. If she wanted to keep track of him, she could adopt a completely different appearance, thinking he would never suspect. Yet the illusion would be easiest to maintain if it corresponded somewhat to her natural contours. Take off a few pounds here and there, modify the voice. Could be. If he fell for the ruse, he could be in dire danger of being led into corruption. Only the soldier's special magic gave it away. But how could he be sure? Even if Dee represented some critical threat to him, he had to be sure he identified the right danger. A man who stepped around a venom mouse could be overlooking a harpy on the other side. Snap judgments about magic were suspect. A brilliant notion came to him. Dee, you must be thirsty, he said. Have a drink of water. And he proffered his canteen. Oh, thank you, she said, taking it gladly. The water cured all ills. An enchantment was an ill, wasn't it? So if she drank, it might show her, at least momentarily, in her true guise. Then he would know. Dee drank deeply. There was no change. Oh, this is very good, she said. I feel so much better. The two men exchanged glances. Scratch one bright notion. Either Dee was not Iris, or the sorceress had better control than he had supposed. He had no way of knowing. Now, be on your way, girl, Crombie said curtly. I am going to see the magician Humphrey, she said contritely. I need a spell to make me well. Again, Bink and Crombie exchanged glances. Dee had drunk the magic water. She was well. Therefore, she had no need to see the good magician on that score. She had to be lying. And if she were lying, what was she concealing from them? She must have picked this particular destination because she knew Bink was going there. Yet this was still conjecture. It could be pure coincidence. Or she could be an ogre in female form. A healthy ogre, waiting for the expedient moment to strike. Crombie, seeing Bink's indecision, made a decision of his own. If you let her go with you, then I'm coming too. With my hand ever on my sword, watching her all the time. Maybe that's best, Bink agreed reluctantly. I bear you no malice, Dee protested. I would do nothing to hurt you, even were I able. Why don't you believe me?" Bink found it too complicated to explain. "You can travel with us if you want to," he said. Dee smiled gratefully, but Crombie shook his head grimly and fingered the hilt of his sword. Crombie remained suspicious, but Bink soon discovered he enjoyed Dee's company. She had no trace of the personality of the sorceress. She was such an average girl that he identified with her to a considerable extent. She seemed to have no magic. At least, she evaded that subject. Perhaps she was going to the magician in the hope of finding her talent. Maybe that was what she had meant by needing a spell to make her well. Who was in good shape in Xanth without magic? However, if she were the sorceress Iris, her ruse would be quickly exposed by the divination of the magician, so the truth would be known. They stopped at the Spring of Life to refill their canteens, traveled half a day, then got caught by a technicolor hailstorm. It was magic, of course, or magic augmented. The colors gave it away, which meant that there would not be any great melting or runoff. All they had to do was take shelter from it until it passed. But they happened to be on a barren ridge. No trees for miles around. No caves. No houses. The land went up and down, cut away by erosion gullies, strewn with boulders. But there was nothing to shield them effectively from the storm. Pelted by increasingly large hailstones, the three scurried in the direction Crombie's magic pointed. The route to safe shelter. It came into view behind a boulder, a monstrously spreading tentacular tree. "That's a tangler!" Bink exclaimed in horror. "We can't go there!" Crombie was brought up short, peering through the hail.
"So it is. My talent never pointed wrong before."
Except when it accused Dee, Bink thought. He wondered just how reliable the soldier's magic really was. For one thing, why hadn't it pointed out the soldier's danger to himself before he got stabbed in the back and left to die? But Bink did not say that out loud. There were often complexities and confusions in magic, and he was sure Crombie meant well. "There's a heffalump there," Dee cried. "Half eaten." Sure enough, a huge carcass lay near the trunk orifice of the tree. Its posterior was gone, but the front end was untouched. The tree had evidently caught it and consumed as much as it could, but a heffalump was so large that even a tangle tree could not polish it off in one meal. Now the tree was sated, its tentacles dangling listlessly. "So, it's safe after all," Bink said, wincing as an egg-sized red hailstone just missed his head. The hail was puffy and light, but it still could hurt. It will be hours before the tree revives enough to become aggressive. Maybe even days. And even then, it'll start on the lump first. Still, Crombie balked, understandably.
"Could be an illusion, that carcass," he warned. "Be suspicious of all things. That's the soldier's motto. A trap to make us think the tree's docile. How do you think it tempted the heffalump in there?
Telling point. Periodic hailstorms on the ridge to drive prey to cover, and seemingly ideal cover waiting. Beautiful system. But we'll be knocked silly by hail if we don't get to cover soon, Bink said. I'll go, Dee said. Before Bink could protest, she plunged into the territory of the tree. The tentacles quivered, twitching toward her, but lacked the imperative to make a real effort. She dashed up and kicked the heffalump in the trunk, and it was solid. No mirage, she cried. Come on in.
Unless she's a shill, Crombie muttered. I tell you, she's a threat to you, Bink. If she shilled for the Tangler, she could trick dozens of people into its clutches.
The man was paranoid. Perhaps this was another useful quality for soldiers. Though again, it didn't seem to have kept him out of trouble before. I don't believe it, Bink said. But I do believe this hailstorm. I'm going in. And he went. He passed the outer fringe of tentacles nervously, but they remained quiescent. A hungry tangler was not a subtle plant. It normally grabbed the moment its prey was grabbable. Finally, Crombie followed. The tree shuddered slightly, as if irritated by its inability to consume them, and that was all.
Well, I knew my talent told the truth. It always does,
he said, somewhat weakly. It was actually very nice here. The hailstones had grown to the size of clenched fists, but they bounced off the tree's upper foliage and piled up in a circle around it, caught by a slight depression. Predator trees tended to sit in such depressions, formed by the action of their tentacles while clearing brush and rocks out of the way in order to have an attractive lawn for passing creatures. The refuse was tossed beyond in a great circle, so that in the course of years the land surface rose. The tangle was a highly successful type of tree, and some of them formed walls whose rims were fashioned from buried bones of past prey. They had been cleaned out near the North Village, but all children were instructed in this menace. Theoretically, a man pursued by a dragon could skirt a tangler, leading the dragon within range of the tentacles, if he had both courage and skill. Within the shielded area, there was a fine greensward rising in soft hillocks, rather like the torso of a woman. Soft perfume odors wafted through, and the air was pleasantly warm. In short, this was a seemingly ideal place to seek shelter, and that was by design. It had certainly fooled the heffalump. Obviously, this was a good location, for the tangler had grown to enormous girth. But right now, they were here, rent-free.
Well, my magic was right all the time,
Crombie said.
I should have trusted it. But by the same token,
he glanced meaningfully at Dee. Bink wondered about that. He believed in the soldier's sincerity, and the location magic was obviously functional. Had it malfunctioned in Dee's case? Or was she really as bad if obscure threat? If so, what kind? He could not believe she meant him harm. He had suspected her of being Iris the sorceress, But now he didn't believe that. She showed no sign of the temperament of the mistress of illusion, and personality was not something that magic could conceal for very long. "Why didn't your magic warn you of the stab in the back?" Fink asked the soldier, making another attempt to ascertain what was reliable and what was not.
I didn't ask it, Crombie said. I was a damned fool. But once I see you safely to your magician, I'll sure as hell ask it who stabbed me. And then...
He fingered the blade of his sword meaningfully. A fair answer. The talent was not a warning signal. It merely performed on demand. Crombie had obviously had no reason to suspect danger, any more than Bink had reason to feel threatened now. Where was the distinction between natural caution and paranoia? The storm continued. None of them were willing to sleep, because they did not trust this tree to that extent, so they sat and talked. Crombie told a tough story of ancient battle and heroism in the days of Xanth's fourth wave. Bink was no military man, but he found himself caught up in the gallantry of it, and almost wished he had lived in those adventurous times, when men of no magic were considered men. But by the end of that story, the storm had eased off, but the hail was piled so high that it didn't seem worthwhile to go out yet. Usually the melt-off from a magic storm was quite rapid once the sun came out again, so it was worth waiting for. "Where do you live?" Bink asked Dee. "Oh, I'm just a country girl, you know," she said. "No one else was going to travel through the wilderness."
That's no answer,
Crombie snapped suspiciously. She shrugged. "It's the only answer I have. I can't change what I am, much as I might like to." "It's the same answer I have, too," Bink said. "I'm just a villager. Nothing special. I hope the magician will be able to make me into something special by finding out that I have some good magic talent no one ever suspected, and I'm willing to work for him for a year for that." "Yes," she said, smiling appreciatively at him. Suddenly he found himself liking her. She was ordinary, like him. She was motivated, like him. They had something in common.
You're going for magic so your girl back home will marry you?
Crombie asked, sounding cynical. "Yes," Bink agreed, remembering Sabrina with sudden poignancy. Dee turned away. "And so I can stay in Xanth."
You're a fool. A civilian fool,"
the soldier said kindly. "Well, it's the only chance I have," Bink replied. "Any gamble is worthwhile when the alternative—"
"I don't mean the magic. That's useful. And staying in Xanth makes sense. I mean marriage."
"Marriage?"
"Women are the curse of mankind,"
Crombie said vehemently.
"They trap men into marriage, the way this tingle tree traps prey. They torment them the rest of their lives."
"Now that's unfair," Dee said. "Didn't you have a mother?"
"She drove my worthy father to drink and loco," Crombie asserted. "Made his life hell on earth. And mine, too. She could read our minds. That was her talent.
A woman who could read men's minds. Hell indeed for a man. Any woman had been able to read Bink's mind? Ugh. Must have been hell for her, too, Dee observed. Bink suppressed a smile, but Crombie scowled.
I ran off and joined the army 2 years before I was of age. Never regretted it.
Dee frowned. You don't sound like God's gift to women, either. We can all be thankful you never touched any.
Oh, I touched them,
Crombie said with a coarse laugh.
I just don't marry them. No one of them's gonna get her hooks into me.
You're disgusting, she snapped.
I'm smart. And if Bink's smart, he'll not let you start tempting him either.
I wasn't, she exclaimed angrily. Crombie turned away in evident repugnance.
Ah, you're all the same. Why do I waste my time talking with the likes of you? Might as well argue ethics with the devil.
Well, if you feel that way, I'll go, Dee said. She jumped to her feet and stalked to the edge. Bink thought she was bluffing, for the storm, though abating, was still in force with occasional flurries. Colored hailstones were mounded up 2 feet high, and the sun was not yet out. But Dee plunged out into it. Hey, wait! Bink cried. He ran after her. Dee had disappeared, hidden by the storm.
Let her go. Good riddance, Crombie said. She had designs on you. I know how they work. I knew she was trouble from the start.
Bink put his arms up over his head and face against the hail and stepped out. His feet slid out from under, skidding on hailstones, and he fell headlong into the pile. Hailstones closed in over his head. Now he knew what had happened to Dee. She was buried somewhere out here. He had to close his eyes, for powder from crushed stones was getting into them. This was not true ice, but coalesced vapor. Magic. The stones were dry and not really cold, but they were slippery. Something caught his foot. Bink kicked violently, remembering the sea monster near the island of the sorceress, forgetting that it had been an illusion and that there could hardly be a sea monster here. But its grip was tight. It dragged him into an enclosure. He scrambled to his feet as it let go. He leaped on the troll shape he saw through the film of dust. Bink found himself flying through the air. He landed hard on his back, the creature drawing on his arm. Trolls were tough. He squirmed around and tried to grab its legs, but the thing dropped on top of him and pinned him firmly to the ground.
Ease up, Bink, it said. It's me, Crombie.
Bink did as much of a double take as he was able to, considering his position, and recognized the soldier. Crombie let him up.
I knew you'd never find your way out of that mess, so I hauled you out by the one part I could reach, your foot. You had magic dust in your eyes, so you couldn't recognize me. Sorry I had to put you down.
Magic dust. Of course. It distorted the vision, making men seem like trolls, ogres, or worse. and vice versa. It was an additional it was an additional hazard of such storms, so that people could not see their way out of them. Probably many victims had seen the tangled tree as an innocent blanket tree. That's okay, Bink said. You soldiers sure know how to fight.
All part of the business. Never charge a man who knows how to throw.
Crombie raised one finger near his ear, signifying an idea.
I'll show you how to do it. It's a non-magical talent you can use.
Dee! Bink cried. She's still out there! Crombie grimaced.
Okay, I made her walk out. If it means so much to you, I'll help you find her.
So the man did have some decency, even with regard to women. Do you really hate them all? Bink asked as he girded himself to wrestle with the hail again. Even the ones who don't read minds?
They all read minds,
Crombie asserted.
Most of them do it without magic, is all. But I won't swear as there's no girl in the whole of Xanth for me. I found a pretty one who wasn't mean or nagging or deceitful.
He shook his head.
But if any like that exist, they sure as hell wouldn't marry me.
So the soldier rejected all women because he felt they rejected him. Well, it was a good enough rationale. Now the storm had stopped. They went out into the piled hailstones, stepping carefully so as not to take any more spills. The colored storm clouds cleared, dissipating rapidly now that their magic imperative was spent. What caused such storms? Bink wondered. They had to be inanimate, but the course of this journey had convinced him that dead objects did indeed have magic. Often, very strong magic. Maybe it was in the very substance of Xanth, and it diffused slowly into the living and non-living things that occupied the land. The living things controlled their shares of magic, channelizing it, focusing it, making it manifest at will. The inanimate things released it haphazardly, as in this storm. There had to be a lot of magic here, gathered from a large area, all wasted in a pointless mass of hailstones. Yet, not all pointless. Obviously, the tangle tree benefited from such storms, and probably there were other ways in which they contributed to the local ecology. Maybe the hail culled out the weaker creatures, animals less fit to survive, facilitating wilderness evolution, and other inanimate magic was quite pointed, such as that of Lookout Rock and the Spring of Life, its magic distilled from water percolating through the entire region, intensifying its potency. Perhaps it was the magic itself that made these things conscious of their individuality. Every aspect of Xanth was affected by magic and governed by it. Without magic, Xanth would be, the very notion filled him with horror, Xanth would be mundane. The sun broke through the clouds. Where the beam struck, the hailstones puffed into colored vapor. Their fabric of magic could not withstand the beat of direct sunlight. That made Bink wonder again. Was the sun antipathetic to magic? If the magic emanated from the depths, the surface of the land was the mere fringe of it. If someone ever delved down deep, he might approach the actual source of power. Intriguing notion. In fact, Bink wished he could set aside his quest for his own personal magic and make that search for the ultimate nature of reality in Xanth. Surely, way down deep, there was the answer to all his questions. But he could not. For one thing, he had to locate Dee. In a few minutes, all the hail was gone. But so was the girl.
She must have slid down the slope into the forest, Crombie said. She knows where we are. She can find us if she wants to.
Unless she's in trouble, Bink said worriedly. Use your talent. Point her out. Crombie sighed.
All right.
He closed his eyes, rotated, and pointed down the south side of the ridge. They trotted down and found her tracks in the soft earth at the fringe of the jungle. They followed them and soon caught up. Dee! Bink cried gladly. We're sorry. Don't risk the jungle alone. She marched on determinedly. Leave me alone, Dee said. I don't want to go with you. But Crombie didn't really mean, Bink said. He meant, you don't trust me. So keep away from me. I'd rather make it on my own. And that was that. She was adamant. Bink certainly wasn't going to force her. Well, you need help or anything? Call, or something. She went on without answering. She couldn't have been very much of a threat, Bink said forlornly.
She's a threat, all right, Crombie insisted. But no threat's as much of a threat when it's somewhere else.
They ascended the ridge again and traveled on. In another day they came in sight of the magician's castle. Thanks to the soldier's unerring magic directional sense and ability to avoid the dangers of the wilderness, he had been a big help.
Well, that's it, Crombie said. I have seen you to this point safely, and I think that about squares us. I've business of my own elsewhere before I report to the king for reassignment. I hope you find your magic.
I hope so too, Bink said. Thanks for the throws you taught me.
It was little enough. You got to practice them a lot more before they'll really serve. Sorry I got the girl mad at you. Maybe my talent was wrong about her after all.
Bink didn't care to discuss that aspect, so we just shook hands and headed for the castle of the good magician.